The historical figure known as King Edward entered the world sometime during the night of the 17th of June 1239, or in the early hours of the 18th, at the Palace of Westminster, then situated on the western edge of the city of London. His mother was Eleanor of Provence, a French aristocrat his father had wed 3 years prior to Edward's birth. Their union, Henry and Eleanor's, was marked by affection, unusual in an era when royal marriages were frequently orchestrated for political reasons. Subsequent to Edward's arrival, she and Henry welcomed 4 more children, a son, Edmund, and 3 daughters, Margaret, Beatrice, and Catherine. While 3 of Edward's siblings reached adulthood, Catherine passed away before reaching the age of 4. Young Edward arrived during a period when England was experiencing significant political unrest. His grandfather, King John, who governed England from 1119 to 1216, had been a disputed and, in many respects, weak ruler. In the early 1200s, John involved himself in catastrophic wars in France, leading to the forfeiture of many of England's vast holdings in the north of the country to France's King Philip II, particularly the Duchy of Normandy, which had constituted the heart of the English presence across the English Channel. Subsequently, in the mid-1210s, John confronted an uprising by his own English lords, known as the First Barons' War. Aiming to subdue the discontent, John introduced certain political changes before his death in 1216, including the Magna Carta, or, as was customary for royal offspring at the time, Edward was largely brought up, apart from his parents, within his own royal establishment. Letters from his father reveal a paternal solicitude for the young prince, though perhaps not of the type common today. In 1242, when Edward was about 3, Henry voiced concern that his son lacked good wine to drink. During his youth, Edward's care was entrusted first to Hugh Gifford, and then, in 1246, to Bartholomew Pecha, a close confidant of the king's. Significant worries about Edward's health emerged around this period, and these concerns did not entirely subside until the early 1250s. In 1254, though merely 14, Edward was wed to Eleanor of Castile, who was slightly more than a year his junior. The marriage of this pair, barely adolescents, served as a political move intended to strengthen English authority in its remaining French territory of Gascony, located just north of the Kingdom of Castile in Spain. Despite the arranged foundation of the marriage, it proved very happy. Eleanor and Edward were deeply attached to one another, and she traveled everywhere with him, even accompanying him years later on crusade to the Holy Land. Their long union, spanning over 35 years, produced numerous offspring. It is thought there were 14 in total, although the precise count is uncertain in an age where infant death and stillbirths were frequent. These children generally arrived over a 20-year span between 1264 and 1284. However, only one son, the future King Edward II, survived to maturity, along with 5 daughters: Eleanor, Joan, Margaret, Mary, and Elizabeth, though Eleanor too would pass away before her 30th year. Thus, at least 8 of their children perished in infancy or childhood, a mortality rate unusually harsh even for the standards of that period for Edward and Eleanor. By the late 1250s, Edward found himself drawn into the political conflicts of his father's reign. A multitude of problems, including the perception of the king's financial irresponsibility and his undue favor towards the queen's French relatives at court, coalesced to compel many English lords and elements of the powerful French faction, led by the influential political figure Simon de Montfort, to pressure Henry into making concessions during a parliament convened at Oxford in 1258. The resulting provisions of Oxford led to the expulsion of many of Henry's French counselors from influential roles, and the governance of England was effectively transferred to a committee of 15 counselors chosen from the realm's leading magnates and nobles. Edward's stance in this situation was unclear, and he did not wholeheartedly back his father. Indeed, when an even more radical set of reforms, the provisions of Westminster, were imposed on the king in 1259, the rebellious lords responsible had Edward's own support. All this culminated in a significant diminishment of the king's authority, while Edward, feeling constrained by his father recently, gained a more prominent position within this council-based government of the late 1250s. Though often regarded as a weak monarch, Henry was unwilling to accept this reduction of his authority. He sought assistance from the French king, Louis IX, against his own nobles by formally renouncing English claims to the Duchy of Normandy and other French territories effectively lost over half a century earlier. In exchange, Louis furnished Henry with financial and military aid, enabling him to return to England in 1260 and begin restoring his royal power. By late 1261, de Montfort had been exiled to France, and Edward, after considerable maneuvering, had reconciled with his father. He was briefly dispatched to Gascony in France, where he stabilized the area, but ongoing disturbances in England led to his recall. Subsequently, when de Montfort returned from France to England in the spring of 1263, a fresh opposition movement started to form at Oxford. By autumn, armed confrontations between the king and his adversaries were taking place, and by the winter of 1263, de Montfort's coalition of disparate lords managed to gain control of London. This time, the matter was referred to King Louis Napoleon for the arbitration. However, Louis ruled in Henry's favor, proposing the cancellation of the earlier provisions agreed upon at Oxford and Westminster in 1258 and 1259. Consequently, de Montfort and his supporters opted for renewed conflict, initiating what is known as the Second Barons' War. Unlike the late 1250s, when the Civil War began in 1264, Edward remained firmly loyal to his father. In April, he played a principal role in capturing Northampton, where one of Simon de Montfort's sons was assembling a large baronial force. However, the war's outcome would be decided in the south, and early that summer, fortunes turned drastically against the royalists. At the Battle of Lewes in Sussex, southeast England, on May 14, 1264, the royalist army clashed with de Montfort's forces. Edward effectively commanded the cavalry on the right flank of his father's army, but the battle was ultimately lost as de Montfort's troops held a strategic position on the high ground of Offham Hill. Following the defeat, Edward was taken hostage and confined, while Henry was compelled to grant massive concessions to de Montfort. Sustained campaigns throughout the summer of 1265 regained control over much of northern and western England for the crown, forcing de Montfort to confront Edward in battle at Evesham on August 4, 1265. Here, Edward skillfully outmaneuvered de Montfort before the fighting began, putting him on the defensive from the start. The engagement resulted in a decisive victory for Edward, during which de Montfort was slain and the king was finally liberated. Victory at Evesham did not conclude the war. Military operations persisted through late 1265 and into 1266 before the final major resistance point, Kenilworth, was besieged. Edward briefly participated in the siege during the summer of 1266. The dictum of Kenilworth was proclaimed in October, establishing conditions under which former rebels could buy back their lands from the crown. It was hoped this would induce the garrison to surrender, but they refused, holding out until December. By that time, Edward had traveled north to handle further operations aimed at eliminating remaining rebels there. A final effort was made by the Lords against London early in 1267. Led by the Earl of Gloucester, it posed a serious risk that the war's tide might turn once more. But Edward initiated negotiations with Gloucester, who was effectively persuaded to desist. Following this, hostilities began to subside. Edward campaigned to the Isle of Ely in the early summer, seizing it with little trouble, while a final advance into the Fens in early July resulted in the surrender of the last rebels. The Second Barons' War concluded, with Edward having played a crucial part in securing victory for his father's cause. Plans were swiftly set in motion to achieve a political resolution and end the tensions that had fueled the Second Barons' War. The outcome was the Statute of Marlborough, issued in November 1267. This statute implemented, this time with royal approval, some of the legal and financial reforms sought in the late 1250s, which Edward himself had briefly endorsed. Edward's precise role in the discussions surrounding these changes remains unclear. Indeed, determining his exact position in government during the late 1260s is generally difficult. Frequent disputes involved him, including one with the Earl of Gloucester concerning their overlapping authorities near the town of Bristol. Some evidence suggests Edward participated in royal councils, but certainly not to the extent one might expect given his significant role in ending the war, although he did acquire extensive estates through land confiscations after the conflict. Overall, his political apprenticeship had been varied. He had acquired substantial experience as a military leader and, to a lesser degree, as an administrator. But Edward had also developed a reputation, perhaps sometimes exaggerated, for political maneuvering. Someone willing to align with his father's adversaries in the late 1250s, only to switch allegiance rapidly in the early 1260s. Despite his father's advancing age and declining health, Edward became resolved in the late 1260s to embark on a crusade to the Holy Land. The Crusades had been a foundational aspect of European life during the High Middle Ages. Starting in the 1090s, the papacy began exhorting Christendom's monarchs, lords, and knights that it was their sacred obligation as faithful followers of God to attempt reclaiming the Holy Land, particularly Jerusalem, from the Muslim control there. A first crusade in the closing years of the 11th century proved highly successful, capturing Jerusalem and several other cities like Antioch and Acre, and establishing 4 Crusader states. However, during the 12th century, these states weakened, and Jerusalem was eventually conquered by the Muslim leader Saladin in 1187. Despite a determined effort by Edward's great-uncle, King Richard the Lionheart, to recapture it during the Third Crusade in the early 1190s, the city remained outside Christian control, and the other Crusader states continued to diminish into the 13th century, notwithstanding numerous subsequent crusades. Edward's father had long harbored hopes of going on crusade himself, but now Edward assumed this responsibility for him. In the early 1270s, Edward would lead what became the Ninth Crusade, though it is often called Lord Edward's Crusade due to his pivotal role. It was initiated in reaction to the danger posed to the remaining Christian presence in the Levant by the Mamluk Sultan Baybars. When the Pope called for the crusade, the French king and his sons had pledged to take the cross and journey to the Holy Land. Consequently, Edward perhaps felt obligated to represent the English royal family. Although there is little doubt he was also an eager participant, the expedition received partial funding from the crown, but Edward covered a significant portion of the cost through his own household, a substantial undertaking. Approximately 225 knights committed to traveling with the prince, supplemented by several hundred additional troops and support personnel. The majority were royalists who had fought for the crown during the English civil conflicts of the 1250s and 1260s. Many lords who had only recently reconciled with the crown were hesitant to join the royal expedition. Because of all this, the crusade that departed England in the summer of 1270 was notably small compared to some earlier ones. Recruitment had proved challenging, and even the financing was uncertain, relying heavily on a $17,500 loan from King Louis IX of France, leader of the much larger French force, with intentions to raise taxes in England later to cover the cost. Edward's army traveled behind the considerably larger French force. When he finally rendezvoused with them in late autumn 1270 at Tunis in North Africa, he discovered that King Louis IX had succumbed to dysentery some weeks prior. There, the new commander of the French contingent, Charles of Anjou, negotiated with the Emir of Tunis to divert the expedition to Sicily to address matters in Italy, where the French had become involved in the southern part of the country years earlier. Edward was outraged by this redirection and chose instead to proceed with his small contingent along the original route, heading east as intended. He landed at the Crusader fortress of Acre in the Holy Land in mid-May 1271. Lord Edward's crusade perhaps achieved an immediate success upon his arrival. The Christian port faced a threat from the Mamluk leader, Baybars at the time, and some contemporary accounts suggest Edward's arrival averted an attack on the town. However, Arab sources are less laudatory of the English lord in this regard. Regardless, when Baybars did appear outside Acre's walls early that summer, possessing far superior forces than Edward commanded, he could almost certainly have captured the town had he chosen to besiege it. Edward's admittedly small forces remained sheltered at Acre for over 6 weeks before finally undertaking a sortie to St. Georges de l'Aubaine, approximately 25 kilometers away. The intense summer heat and incidents of food poisoning halted any attempts to advance further. A campaign against Kakun, about 65 kilometers from Acre, in the early winter yielded more success, resulting in the defeat of a Muslim force outside the town. However, the main citadel remained untaken, and the Crusaders eventually withdrew to Acre once more. Ultimately, the fundamental problem was the limited achievement possible with the scant resources in manpower and finances available to Edward, following the French withdrawal from the crusade a year earlier. Consequently, it was unsurprising when Hugh III, the King of Cyprus and titular King of Jerusalem, reached a 10-year truce with Baybars in the early summer of 1272. Edward reacted angrily to the decision, but the Cypriot king was keen to capitalize on the Mamluk leader's willingness to agree to such terms. This willingness arose after a significant Mongol incursion into the Levant late in 1271 temporarily threatened the Mamluk rear, but quickly subsided. Edward stayed in the Holy Land until September 1272, harboring hopes of potentially changing Hugh's mind, but the crusade was essentially finished. Perhaps the most remarkable event during Edward's time in the Middle East happened one night in his bedchamber when he was assaulted and nearly killed by an assassin. The identity of who ordered the attack is uncertain. Some accounts attribute it to Baibars, while others suggest it was commanded by a mysterious old man of the mountains, the leader of a zealous Islamic sect. During this attempt on his life, Edward managed to repel and slay his attacker, but was wounded with a poisoned dagger in the process. According to accounts, his wife Eleanor then sucked the venom from the wound, possibly saving her husband's life. The couple subsequently departed the Holy Land in September 1272. As it became clear their lives were endangered and little more could be accomplished for the Christian cause, Edward commenced his return journey to England in September. He left behind a crusader presence living on borrowed time. In the subsequent years, pressure on Acre from the Mamluks and others persisted, and Edward, like his fellow European monarchs, would receive repeated pleas for further assistance throughout the 1270s and 1280s. These appeals went largely unheeded in any meaningful way, and finally in 1291, the crusader presence in the Holy Land concluded nearly 200 years after it began, when Acre fell to the Mamluks. Preparations for Edward's coronation were well advanced before his eventual arrival in England on August 2, 1274. Consequently, the ceremony could be held just over 2 weeks later, on August 19th. Disputes inevitably arose regarding precedence, with Edward's brother Edmund advocating for a more significant role due to his service as steward of the realm during Edward's absence. Meanwhile, a recurring disagreement at medieval royal coronations over the seniority of the archbishops of Canterbury and York resulted in the latter being excluded entirely from the ceremony. Otherwise, the proceedings unfolded smoothly, and the celebration was conducted on a magnificent scale. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert Kilwardby, placed the crown upon Edward's head, which he promptly removed, declaring he would not wear it again until the territories England had lost under his father were recovered. Thus, he proclaimed the dawn of a new era. The man who had just become king is frequently depicted as a stern Machiavellian figure, but this portrayal is not entirely precise. Standing at 6 feet, 2 inches, Edward earned the moniker Longshanks due to his exceptional height in an era when few men reached 6 feet. By his coronation, the blonde hair of his youth had started to darken and would turn gray in his middle age. He spoke with a very slight lisp, yet with determination and persuasiveness. Religiously, he was orthodox, making conventional contributions to churches and monasteries, though possessing nowhere near the religious fervor of his father. He likely wasn't widely read, but demonstrated his cultural inclinations through patronage of architecture and painting, notably supporting Walter of Durham, who contributed significantly to decorating the interiors of Westminster Abbey. Temperamentally, he could be good-humored and friendly, but was also susceptible to fierce anger. He relished hunting and was a strong proponent of linking the Arthurian legend to the English monarchy. Ultimately, though, his administrative skills were limited in many areas, displaying very little grasp of the complexities of finance and logistics. However, what he lacked in this domain, he more than compensated for with his sense of resolve and vigor, qualities absent in an English monarch since the time of his great-uncle, Richard the Lionheart, over 70 years before. One of the initial challenges Edward faced as king upon returning to England originated from the west, in Wales. The Normans had established substantial control over Wales following their conquest of England in the 11th century, a control maintained and even reinforced for much of the 12th century. However, the diminished strength of the English crown during the reigns of Edward's grandfather and father had led to a series of uprisings there by Welsh princes, notably Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, aiming to reassert Wales's independence from England. Yet ap Gruffudd failed to recognize the strengthened position of the English crown by the 1270s. Therefore, Edward anticipated Llywelyn paying homage to him, just as his predecessors had routinely done. His grandfather, Llywelyn the Great, for example, had paid homage to both King John and Henry III in the 1200s and 1210s. Consequently, when Llywelyn entered English territory in the March region, Edward saw it as the action of a rebellious subordinate and resolved to move against him. He received assistance in this because ap Gruffudd had alienated several other Welsh princes who had taken refuge at the English court. Thus, in the summer of 1277, Edward, leading a large royal army of 15,000 men supported by a fleet, advanced into northern Wales. No fighting was necessary. Llywelyn understood that this display of overwhelming force signaled that his ambitions needed restraint. and he reached an agreement with Edward through the Treaty of Aberconwy. This treaty severely restricted his authority in Wales and obligated him to pay a substantial indemnity of $50,000 to the English crown. As a result, the homage previously rendered by Welsh lords to kings like Henry II in the 12th century was swiftly restored under Edward. This certainly did not resolve the issue. A new conflict erupted 5 years later in 1282. On this occasion, Edward confronted an alliance of Welsh princes, many of whom had sided with him in 1277, but were now disappointed by his failure to adequately reward their assistance after that invasion. Llywelyn's brother Dafydd initiated hostilities by attacking Hawarden Castle in April, followed by further assaults on English castles in the area. Edward demonstrated the same determination he had shown 5 years prior. In his view, Llywelyn and the other Welsh lords were not independent rulers of a foreign land, but rebels within a country long under English control who were refusing to offer proper fealty to him as their monarch. This was a perspective Edward would later apply to England's northern neighbor as well. Thus, the final Welsh stronghold surrendered in April 1283, just 1 year after the war began. Dafydd ap Gruffudd was delivered to Edward's government shortly thereafter and executed, thereby crushing the resistance of the primary opponents to English intervention in Wales. Victory in 1283 led to one of the most comprehensive English diminutions of Welsh independence ever witnessed. The Statute of Wales was enacted in 1284, extending English systems of governance into Wales. New English-style counties were established, and English local government was implemented. Many Welsh nobles were deprived of their inheritance, and their lands were granted to English followers of Edward. To solidify this new imposition of English rule, an extensive program of castle construction was also undertaken at locations like Conwy, Caernarfon, and Harlech. New towns quickly developed at these sites, and others such as Flint, Aberystwyth, and Rutland, while attempts were made to anglicize existing Welsh towns. Yet there were constraints to all this, and it should not be presumed that Edward I finalized the English subjugation of Wales. Uprisings occurred in 1287 and again in 1294, the latter necessitating a huge deployment of English military power. Almost 30,000 men were involved in some capacity before the revolt was finally quelled in the spring of 1295. Altogether, the endeavor diverted Edward from issues he faced elsewhere by the 1290s and had cost the monarchy an enormous sum of $55,000 to suppress, underscoring how uncertain control over Wales would remain for many years. The challenge of funding armies like those utilized in Wales at various times between the mid-1270s and the mid-1290s was a significant worry for an administration aiming to re-establish English power substantially on multiple fronts. A major restructuring of English finances and government was consequently undertaken to boost revenue to the exchequer. No sooner had Edward been crowned than he named a close ally, Robert Burnell, as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Burnell immediately announced an investigative committee into various aspects of government finances and administration, its main objective being to identify concealed lands to which the Crown held title, but for which documentation was missing. Though the outcomes varied, this inquiry did shape the creation of the extensive Statutes of Westminster, issued in the spring of 1275. This was the first of several acts down to 1290, aiming to end the misuse of land tenure and the sub-infeudation of land, which deprived lords of their feudal payments. The rights of tenants were also addressed, while the Crown sought to limit ecclesiastical bodies and others from alienating territories without royal approval, enabling the Crown to better obtain its revenues from such dealings. Overall, this legislation represented significant alterations to Crown finances, landholding, and debt issues in medieval England. While the 1274 inquiry and the resulting Statutes of Westminster in 1275 initiated the process of reforming certain elements of landholding and other crown-related issues, they did not rectify the financial problem. Further monetary steps were introduced as a result in 1275. A customs duty of 6 shillings and 8 pence was imposed on sacks of wool being sent abroad from England. The English textile commerce at the time was very considerable, and this reasonable tariff produced approximately $10,000 annually for Edward's treasury, a sum comparable to tens of millions of pounds today. Added to this was a single levy of 1/15 of the value of personal property, a form of medieval wealth tax that yielded upwards of $80,000. These measures were supplemented by reforms to the operation of the exchequer, while the church also faced further levies from 1279 onwards. That same year, a reminting was carried out, a measure undertaken for the twin objectives of eliminating counterfeit currency from circulation and securing the monarchy an extra financial benefit in its new minting of coins. Such measures needed to be done periodically in an age when coin value was still largely based on the precious metal value of the coins in circulation. While these efforts at financial reform were generally effective, they still proved inadequate for Edward's government to cover the expenses of its wars over the years. For instance, when disturbances emerged in Wales again in the early 1280s, it caught the monarchy unprepared, and money had to be obtained quickly. Initially, the shortfall was covered by taking borrowings from the wealthy trading groups of the towns, totaling over $16,000. When this was inadequate to address the military needs, local gatherings were called for early in 1283 in the north of England and other districts. Italian merchant bankers, such as the Riccardi family, whose influence as bankers spread across much of Western and Central Europe. What all of this showed was that despite the success of the 1270s reforms, England still could not fund a large-scale military campaign for an extended period without employing unusual methods to gather extra funds. Consequently, additional changes to the exchequer were implemented in the 1280s. Notably, the Statute of Rutland, which aimed to enhance accounting and eliminate the graft that was widespread in all earlier societies. These measures ultimately resulted in growing effectiveness in the governmental machinery of the English state during Edward's reign. All of this lawmaking and financial enhancement of the 1270s and 1280s occurred alongside parliamentary reform. Today, the Magna Carta, enacted in the final months of King John's reign, is usually regarded as the major constitutional milestone of the High Middle Ages in England. But this view is often exaggerated. While it guaranteed certain privileges to the English aristocracy in their interaction with the monarchy, the more important advancements in Parliament, the lawmaking body that would evolve into the progenitor parliament of contemporary democracy, actually started to happen during Edward's reign. For instance, it was Edward who supervised the start of the system, whereby representatives were sent back to Parliament down to the present day. This specified that 2 knights were to be returned to Parliament from every county and 2 burgesses from every incorporated town, a system that began to establish nationwide representation for the first time. This foreshadowed the electoral district model according to which most contemporary democracies choose their legislatures today. In addition, Edward set a precedent in his first Parliament of 1275 by seeking parliamentary consent for special levies, a development intended to prevent the constitutional disputes that had plagued his father's and grandfather's rules. In the process, Edward's significant input to parliamentary developments in England was to create a mutual connection between Crown and populace. The Crown and government could ask for funds, and the populace could seek benefits and changes in return. This system would function well until the 17th century. There were governmental and monetary achievements elsewhere. Though developments in Ireland are rarely discussed in studies of Edward's reign, notable changes occurred there during his more than 4 decades of rule. Much of the country had first been subjugated by England in the late 12th century, though some parts remained beyond English control. English influence was still growing during Edward's reign, though largely driven by the efforts of the Anglo-Norman lords there. 2 actions are noteworthy, though. A lay subsidy tax was started in 1292, and this was employed subsequently to finance the creation of a new Irish legislature with chosen delegates, which convened formally for the first time in 1297. It would endure for more than 5 centuries until the Act of Union incorporated the Irish legislature into the English Parliament at Westminster. In addition to this, Edward's reign saw a notable reinforcement and growth of the judicial structure in Ireland, with central courts in Dublin and provincial courts administering justice under the common law. As a result of all this, Ireland produced a substantial surplus for the English treasury by the end of Edward's reign, and English political analysts on Ireland of the early modern era would reflect from a perspective of over 250 years and regard the early 14th century as the peak of English governance in Ireland. A further matter that affected the finances of Edward's realm was the status of the Jewish population. A substantial Jewish community had developed in England during the late 11th and 12th centuries. As in other parts of Europe, many Jewish individuals began working as financiers, as this was a lucrative activity and the Catholic Church prohibited Christians from engaging in usury, the lending of money at excessive interest rates. Therefore, by the early 12th century, the Jewish community in England was having an involvement in the financial activity of the country that was disproportionate to their population. This occurred alongside increasing hostility towards Jews in England. Jews were seen by Christians of the Middle Ages as responsible for deicide, the killing of God, for having demanded Christ's death. This, coupled with Jewish financial practices and their expanding economic influence, had led to intensifying mistreatment of the country's Jewish community during Edward's father's extended rule, notably in extracting large amounts of money from the country's Jews through special levies and the exertion of significant force on the country's Jewish people to adopt Christianity. Levies targeting all Jewish people over 12 years of age were also implemented. These severely harsh actions were only operational for 15 years. For in 1290, Edward, having concluded that many Jewish people persisted in money lending across the country, decided to banish the Jewish community from England altogether. Edward had just come back from a trip to his French holdings in Gascony in the late 1280s and required raising further funds to finance the military operation. To render this more palatable to the aristocracy and landowning class, he contained a pledge to expel the Jewish community from England, a measure he subsequently carried out in 1290. This offered the extra advantage that Edward was able to seize Jewish territories and assets into royal ownership and dispose of them for a financial gain. The banishment was executed fairly rapidly, with perhaps between 2,000 and 3,000 Jewish people exiled from England in the early 1290s, frequently relocating to Eastern Europe, which was considerably more accepting of their presence. A very small number stayed in England, posing as Italian financiers. Similar to his forebears, Edward was preoccupied with France, though in a distinct way compared to earlier monarchs. His father had concluded pacts with the French in the 1250s, which effectively brought the English monarchy to terms with the forfeiture of the vast lands in northern France. Above all, the Duchy of Normandy, which King John had forfeited in the 1200s. As such, there was not the same obligation for Edward to attempt to restore English authority over Normandy and other areas as had existed in the initial years of Henry's rule. Nevertheless, the English crown maintained a significant foothold in France, governing Gascony in the southwest of France, and this inevitably drew Edward into French affairs. He traveled to Gascony several times, often in an effort to initiate reform efforts there, particularly in the late 1280s. This led to a significant set of changes settled in 1289, which sought to oversee the behavior of the high-ranking English administrators in Gascony, the seneschal of the region, and the constable of the town of Bordeaux. Yet what continued as the main issue for Edward in Gascony was that he possessed the territory as a vassalage of the French king, rather than independently, a situation which in the 1290s would result in conflict. Edward had kept cordial ties with King Philip III of France, who had followed his father after Louis IX's passing at Tunis on his trip to the Holy Land back in 1270. Edward had offered fealty to Philip when traveling via France on his journey back from the Crusades in the mid-1270s, and he visited Paris again in 1279. Unresolved issues between the two crowns had been settled at this time, placing Anglo-French ties in a positive state. Ties between Edward and the subsequent king, Philip IV, who followed his father in 1285, were similarly positive, which renders the start of conflict in the 1290s between England and France a somewhat unexpected turn. The reason was a regional dispute between England and some French commercial seamen working in the English Channel. Edward believed his action against these parties in his role as English monarch was completely warranted, but Philip regarded it as rebellious conduct by Edward as Duke of Aquitaine, the designation he held as ruler of Gascony. An agreement was attained at this point whereby Edward would transfer some small strongholds as a guarantee in Gascony, while Edward would wed Philip's sister, Margaret, a woman almost 4 decades younger. Edward's first spouse, Eleanor, had passed away in 1290 after 36 years of marriage, allowing Edward to wed the French monarch's sister as a method for settling the conflict that had emerged in the English Channel. However, the whole plan proved to be a deception on Philip's part, intended to have the Parlement of Paris approve the seizure of the Duchy of Aquitaine from Edward. With the start of open conflict, Edward's intentions shifted, and he now started forming aspirations to regain some of the lands forfeited by his grandfather 90 years earlier. Edward's approach from the beginning of the war was to form a significant coalition of European states against the French. In particular, he looked for partners among the many principalities of the Low Countries in Western Germany, which in the late medieval era were split into numerous small dukedoms, counties, and city-states, and with the influential Duke of Burgundy, who governed vast lands in eastern France. In this way, Edward aimed to establish a center of strength in the Low Countries around the Duchy of Brabant and the counties of Guelders and Holland, whereby England would advance into northeastern France towards Paris, rather than launching from Gascony, as the French would anticipate. This action was postponed until 1297, by which time the English had experienced varied results in their conflicts with the French in Gascony. In any event, the military operation in the Low Countries turned into an expensive failure from which Edward barely succeeded in freeing himself in the spring of 1298. Thus, this approach resulted in complete defeat in the final years of the 13th century. But the concept of forming a coalition of European allies and attacking France from the Low Countries was one that would be utilized successfully by Edward's grandson against the French many years later. The collapse of Edward's major coalition concluded the peak phase of the war against France, but it took a significant duration for the war to be finalized, even following the arrangement of a ceasefire late in 1297. In 1299, a significant move was made when the earlier arranged wedding between Edward and Philip's sister Margaret eventually occurred. The couple, with a 40-year age difference, were wed at Canterbury on the 10th of September, 1299. Despite the disparity in their years, the marriage was fairly acceptable for both parties, with Margaret providing Edward with 2 sons and a daughter, and she did not wed again after Edward died several years later. Meanwhile, ultimate peace conditions between England and France were eventually resolved in 1303, with a near restoration of the pre-war situation. The war had been an expensive disaster for both parties. Military actions in Gascony alone had cost the English treasury approximately $350,000, while over $150,000 was given as subsidies by the English government to the minor states of the Low Countries and Germany to secure their assistance in the 1290s, yielding virtually no advantage. Such was the enormous expense of the conflict that an official crowning as queen for Margaret was not conducted due to the cost. This expenditure in France and the Low Countries was a specific irritation for Edward, as during the war, the main objective of his foreign strategy had shifted from France to Scotland. King Alexander III had passed away there in 1286, making his 3-year-old granddaughter, Margaret of Norway, his successor. But Margaret passed away in 1290, terminating the direct lineage of King William the Lion, which had governed Scotland for more than 120 years. There were now more than 12 claimants for the Scottish throne, but the 2 leading contenders were Robert Bruce, 5th Lord of Annandale, and John Balliol, Lord of Galloway. To stop the nation descending into internal conflict, the Council of Guardians, designated in Scotland to rule during Margaret's minority, requested King Edward to serve as a mediator. Edward now saw this as a chance to restore a higher level of English sway in Scottish matters. Similar to Wales, Edward regarded Scotland as a subservient component of the Kingdom of England, one over which England had wielded considerable power since the late 11th century when William the Conqueror and his successor, William II, had set up a level of Norman authority over the northern realm. While this influence had diminished over the century prior to his coming to the throne, Edward saw the inheritance dispute as a favorable chance to re-establish English monarchical authority in Scotland. Accordingly, after he backed the claim of John Balliol, who became King John I in 1292, Edward indicated plainly that he now regarded Balliol as a subordinate who was required to offer fealty to him, and Scotland as a semi-subordinate realm. Balliol and the Scottish, however, were reluctant to accept this, and after conflict erupted between England and France in 1294, Balliol not only declined to dispatch Scottish forces to assist Edward, but began discussions with the French to create a partnership. This was primarily the catalyst for Edward's choice to invade and take control of Scotland in 1296. Edward commanded forces to ready themselves at Newcastle upon Tyne in March 1296. At the same time, he dispatched messengers north with requirements for the Scots that they surrender the border fortresses of Roxburgh, Jedburgh, and Berwick as a guarantee against any possible pact they might make with the French. The Scottish not only rejected this, but a Scottish force commanded by John Comyn, Earl of Buchan, advanced south into England against Carlisle Castle on the 26th of March 1296. Here, Edward had named Robert Bruce, 6th Lord of Annandale, as commander of Carlisle Castle. It is suggestive of how certain Scottish nobles at the time truly regarded Edward as a ruler with significant authority over Scotland, that they were prepared to serve the English crown, including inside England. Bruce's son of the same name would have a significant part in the developments that would ensue over the next 30 years in relations between England and Scotland. Comyn did not capture Carlisle Castle, though his troops did ignite the town, while additional border incursions ensued by the Scots throughout April. This, however, was the peak of military success for the Scottish in 1296. In late March, Edward guided his troops over the River Tweed into Scotland. They captured Berwick, at that time the southernmost point of Scotland, within days, and Edward established his base here for some time while he strategized his subsequent action. As the Scottish readied their army near Dunbar Castle, a short distance along the coast of Scotland from Berwick, it was here that the initial phase of what would become a protracted 30-year conflict between England and Scotland would be determined. The Battle of Dunbar was contested between Edward's troops, led by John de Warenne, 6th Earl of Surrey, and the Scottish, commanded by John Comyn, Earl of Buchan, on the 27th of April, 1296. It seems from the remaining proof that this was primarily a conflict between two fairly small mounted units, comprising maybe several hundred armored horsemen on both sides. The Scots held a strong position on high terrain, but their formations disintegrated when they mistakenly thought the English were withdrawing from the battle. Consequently, a well-executed English cavalry assault overwhelmed the Scots, causing them to flee. Approximately 100 Scottish lords and knights were captured, and the next day when Edward arrived personally, Dunbar Castle yielded. Following the battle, several other significant castles across lowland Scotland simply surrendered to Edward's advancing forces. Edinburgh Castle resisted but also succumbed after a week-long siege. Thus, a short campaign concluded in absolute victory for Edward. King John Balliol surrendered, seeking leniency, but Edward had him divested of his crown and sent south into captivity in England. Shortly thereafter, Edward himself headed south, taking the Stone of Scone, the traditional coronation stone of Scottish kings, with him. The significance was unmistakable. John was no longer King of Scotland, and the country would henceforth have no king other than Edward. Edward regarded this as the logical endpoint of a process initiated over 200 years earlier, when William the Conqueror and William II began establishing a measure of English dominion over Scotland. In the wake of the 1296 campaign, the governance of Scotland was largely entrusted to Englishmen, with English garrisons positioned at strategic locations throughout the nation. However, the victory had ultimately been achieved far too easily, and Scottish resistance had never truly been broken. Furthermore, as Edward once again became absorbed by events in France, the opportunity for rebellion quickly arose in 1297. This uprising was led by three figures. Robert Bruce, destined many years later to become King of Scotland himself, was the grandson of the Robert Bruce who had been a claimant to the throne in the early 1290s before Balliol became king. A second rebel commander was Andrew de Moray, a notable esquire from northeastern Scotland. The third, and undoubtedly the most renowned, was Sir William Wallace. Despite later portrayals as a romantic commoner rebel, Wallace belonged to Scotland's lesser nobility. Initially acting independently, the trio succeeded in stirring popular revolts against English authority across the country, culminating in a first major triumph over English forces at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in September 1297. Perhaps most importantly, he encountered the most serious episode of internal strife of his reign within England itself, as the nobility and church leaders voiced multiple complaints about the expense of the wars in France, Scotland, and Wales, and the lack of adequate consultation with them by the monarch. Edward, acutely aware of the difficulties troublesome nobles had inflicted upon both his father and grandfather, acted swiftly to defend his actions, issuing a lengthy letter apologizing for his recent autocratic rule, but contending it was necessary to bring the wars to a rapid end. This did not fully appease the nobles, who sought an amendment to Magna Carta, the great charter King John had agreed upon with his nobles in 1215 to guarantee respect for their rights. While this was not conceded, assurances were given that the extraordinary demands being placed upon the nobility would not be repeated. Inadvertently, the rebellion in Scotland may have bolstered his position, as when the Scots began raiding into northern England following the Battle of Stirling Bridge, it persuaded many in England that Edward's appeals for exceptional taxation and other requests at this time, given the emergency, were justified. Edward reacted promptly to the Scottish incursion upon his return to England from Flanders in the spring of 1298. A large army numbering upwards of 20,000 soldiers was quickly mobilized and led north by Edward. Many were Welsh infantry conscripted into service to prove their loyalty following the major Welsh revolt of the mid-1290s. They gathered at Roxburgh in late June, and from here Edward advanced north towards Falkirk. There he confronted Wallace's army in battle on the 22nd of July, 1298. Edward's forces significantly outnumbered the Scots, but the large Welsh contingent proved restless. The Scots numbered approximately 6,000 men, consisting of about 4,000 long spearmen, organized into 4 schiltrons. Hedgehog-like formations designed to break any charge, including heavy cavalry. The spaces between these were occupied by roughly 500 cavalry and over 1,000 archers. These schiltrons had been employed with devastating results at the Battle of Stirling Bridge the previous year, but here they proved less effective because Edward's cavalry maneuvered to encircle the Scots, pinning their spearmen while thousands of Edward's crossbowmen and archers showered them with projectiles. By day's end, both sides had suffered losses exceeding 2,000 men. But for Wallace, whose army was much smaller than Edward's, this represented a catastrophic defeat. Despite his success at Falkirk, Edward could not fully exploit the victory and re-establish control over all of Scotland in the subsequent months, limiting his dominion to the castles of the border area and southern Scotland. Furthermore, developments in France and his marriage to Margaret meant Edward was once more diverted by events elsewhere in 1299, giving the Scots the chance to recapture Stirling Castle after a protracted siege. With the war in France effectively concluded from late 1299 onwards, Edward could concentrate more on Scotland from 1300. However, despite yearly campaigns into the country, his efforts were hindered by Wallace and other Scottish leaders' reluctance to risk another major defeat like Falkirk. Consequently, Edward faced an adversary in the early 1300s that proved unwilling to engage him directly in open battle. But victory could also be attained through deceit and diplomacy. Robert Bruce was persuaded to join Edward's cause in 1302, while peace in France the following year eliminated any prospect of aid for the Scottish from that quarter. A year later, many Scottish lords reached agreements with Edward after the English retook Stirling Castle. The Scottish cause suffered another setback in the autumn of 1305 when William Wallace was captured near Glasgow by John de Menteith, a Scottish knight loyal to the English crown, and handed over to Edward's government. He was transported to London, where he was hanged, drawn, and quartered at Smithfield on the 23rd of August, 1305. The near-complete victory Edward had once again achieved was highlighted by the decision to appoint English judges to some positions on the Scottish judiciary, while a review of the Scottish legal system commenced to align it with English common law. Similar to the decision to remove the royal coronation stone from Scone in 1296, further symbolic actions were taken to underscore Scottish subjugation, notably the reference around this time in English documents to Scotland as land rather than a kingdom. Edward's triumph in 1305 proved as fleeting as the one he secured in 1296. During a meeting at Greyfriars Kirk in Dumfries, near the Anglo-Scottish border, on the 10th of February 1306, between Robert Bruce and John Comyn, the only 2 plausible remaining contenders for the Scottish throne, Bruce killed Comyn. The dispute arose because Comyn attempted to break an agreement where one would renounce his claim to the throne in exchange for land grants, making him the foremost magnate in Scotland, while the other would become king. When Comyn reneged, Bruce slew him. 5 weeks later, Bruce had himself declared King of Scotland, concluding a 10-year interval during which Edward had effectively governed the Northern Kingdom without a monarch north of the border. The inauguration was symbolically conducted at Scone, the traditional site for crowning Scottish kings, despite Edward having seized the coronation stone and brought it to England a decade earlier. Some royal garments were brought out of concealment to add solemnity to the event. As he did so, Robert initiated a new rebellion against English authority in Scotland. Bruce's decision to rebel early in 1306 may well have been a well-timed move calculated to take advantage of Edward's deteriorating health. By this time, the king was approaching his 70th year, a considerable age by late medieval standards. Despite his frailty, a substantial army was nevertheless prepared under the command of Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke, and Henry Percy, and dispatched north along with another force led by the Prince of Wales, the future Edward II. In the meantime, Edward became intensely vengeful following this latest reversal in a war he had striven to win for 10 years and was determined to show he viewed this as a treasonous uprising by his own subjects, rather than events occurring in an independent realm. Consequently, many prominent Scots living in England were executed during the summer and autumn of 1306 for having weak ties to Bruce, while others were confined in cages displayed publicly at some border fortresses in southern Scotland, a highly unusual penalty for the era. The initial campaign did not fare well for Bruce. Having advanced into Scotland, de Valence conferred with Bruce at Methven in mid-June 1306 with their armies present. It being late, both sides consented to postpone battle until the following day. However, as Bruce's forces camped several miles away that evening, de Valence's troops attacked the Scots in a flagrantly dishonorable violation of the English commander's promise. Heavy casualties were incurred, and Bruce only narrowly managed to escape the onslaught. Then on the 13th of September, the Prince of Wales captured Kildrummy Castle from the Scots, taking Bruce's brother, Nigel, prisoner, along with several other key supporters of the Scottish king. One of these, Sir Simon Fraser, was taken to London and executed, despite having formerly been a courtier at the English court. This aligned with Edward's policy of showing no leniency towards any supporters of Bruce's cause throughout 1306. The king himself remained unfit health-wise to command in the field. Despite Bruce's campaign being at a low point in the autumn and winter of 1306, circumstances began to shift early in 1307. Bruce spent the winter either in the Hebrides of western Scotland or the Orkneys, consolidating support in the Gaeltacht region of Scotland, possibly also visiting Ireland. Here, de Valence led as many as 3,000 men against fewer than 1,000 Scots under Bruce, but the Scots effectively utilized the terrain to counteract de Valence's numerical advantage. Spearmen were employed to the same effect as at Stirling Bridge years earlier, securing a major victory for Bruce over the English. Edward was reportedly enraged by these new setbacks, which signaled the end of any possibility of swiftly overcoming the renewed unrest in Scotland. This was the backdrop against which King Edward I's life concluded. Several weeks after the defeat at Loudon Hill, he reviewed some of the English troops gathered at Carlisle Castle near the border before finally heading north towards Scotland, despite his poor health. His condition worsened immediately as he contracted dysentery, and while encamped at Berg by Sands, just south of the Scottish border, on the morning of the 7th of July, 1307, Edward Longshanks died. A tradition asserts that Edward's final wish was for his heart to be transported to the Holy Land as part of a new crusade the king had always aspired to launch, but never found the opportune moment for. Moreover, it must have been apparent to him that no matter how frequently he dispatched large armies into Scotland and established apparent control, rebellion invariably followed within months. He was succeeded by his son, Edward, Prince of Wales, with whom worrying indications of his reign being dominated by powerful favorites had already surfaced. After several more months campaigning in Scotland, Edward headed south and was crowned king in February 1308. Edward's death marked the beginning of a period of political, social, and economic crisis in England. His son's 20-year reign was turbulent, with Edward II favoring various political allies who incurred the hostility of England's broader political sphere. This was intensified in the mid-1310s when a spate of exceptionally poor weather struck Europe. In 1314, this resulted in nearly 150 consecutive days of rain, followed by widespread crop failures, leading to one of the most devastating famines in the continent's history. Concurrently, an outbreak of a highly virulent form of cattle disease occurred, causing livestock populations to plummet. Tens of thousands perished across England due to these events. And while Edward II's successor in 1327, Edward III, proved a far more competent ruler, Europe was afflicted by one of the most catastrophic plague pandemics in human history, the Black Death, in the 1340s and 1350s, killing upwards of half the population. It is perhaps indicative of the resilience of the English state that had developed by the end of Edward I's reign that his grandson, Edward III, managed to wage a prolonged war against France to attempt resurrecting England's territorial empire on the continent amidst such demographic and economic turmoil caused by the famines and plagues of the 14th century. Ultimately, however, Edward's attempts to bring Scotland under English dominion ended in failure after his own death. In the late 1300s, Robert Bruce emerged as the undisputed leader of the Scottish independence movement. As his forces grew, he applied increasing pressure on the English presence in Scotland. Following victory at the Battle of Loudon Hill in the final weeks of Edward's reign, another battle was won at the Brander Pass in 1308 before expelling the English from Edinburgh. However, the definitive conflict did not take place until 1314, when the Scots achieved a remarkable victory over Edward II's forces at the Battle of Bannockburn. A year later, Bruce's brother Edward invaded the north of Ireland, initiating a 3-year campaign aimed at weakening England's resolve to remain in Scotland by establishing a second front across the Irish Sea. Still, the war continued, and in 1320 the Scottish nobility issued the Declaration of Arbroath, asserting their independence from England, a stance granted papal endorsement in 1324. Even so, it wasn't until another major battlefield victory in 1327 at the Battle of Stanhope Park that the war Edward I had initiated over 30 years earlier finally concluded with the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328. King Edward's body was embalmed following his death near Scotland and transported south. It lay in state at Waltham Abbey for some time before he was finally interred in Westminster Abbey on the 27th of October, 1308, nearly 4 months after his passing. His tomb was crafted plainly from Purbeck limestone, a stone quarried from the Isle of Purbeck in Dorset. It was unadorned and no royal effigy was added to the tomb. Incredibly, this simplicity may have resulted from a lack of resources for a more elaborate burial. Despite all the financial and administrative reforms of his reign, Edward's wars had been so expensive that he had left England largely insolvent. In 1774, the Royal Society of Antiquaries of London had the tomb opened, discovering Edward's body remarkably well preserved over 4.5 centuries later. An inscription was found on the tomb, heavily faded by then, added by the last abbot of Westminster, John Feckenham, in the mid-16th century. Part of it read Malleus Scotorum, meaning the hammer of the Scots. Edward has subsequently become known by this epithet in recognition of how the war in Scotland came to characterize his reign, for better or worse. And despite the endeavor's ultimate failure, Edward I was undeniably one of medieval England's most consequential monarchs. Primarily, he reformed and reinvigorated crown governance after decades of instability under his grandfather and father, a period marked by 2 civil wars, the loss of most French territories, and the Welsh princes achieving de facto independence across much of Wales. The 1270s and 1280s witnessed an impressive reconstruction of royal government, with reforms enacted to secure English control over Gascony, and Wales reconquered with an extensive Anglicization program implemented there. Edward did not finalize the conquest of Wales, but he contributed more significantly than any other monarch towards that goal. While many Welsh people would not consider this an achievement, viewed purely from the perspective of a centralizing state in the High Middle Ages, it represented a considerable accomplishment of Edward's reign. It compelled the Welsh lords to once again pay homage to the English crown and advanced a process initiated in Wales during the Norman conquest of the mid-11th century. Domestically, although not truly an administrator himself, Edward appointed several capable individuals to senior ministerial roles. These officials oversaw a reform program that restructured English land law, tax collection, and various other measures, strengthening the English fiscal and administrative state and enabling it to wage the wars of the latter half of Edward's reign. However, the difficulties of Edward's reign began to escalate in the 1290s. From 1292, when he endorsed John Balliol's claim to the Scottish throne as a subordinate monarch, he became increasingly determined to bring Scotland under English rule. As with Wales, this must be viewed through the lens of the late 13th century. Edward did not explicitly see himself as conquering a foreign nation. Rather, his perspective was that he was re-establishing a form of English authority in Scotland, first instituted under William the Conqueror and William II. Although it had diminished considerably in the intervening period, he saw the opportunity presented by the succession crisis there in 1290 as a means to compel the Scottish lords to once again pay homage to him as their liege lord. However, matters grew more complex in 1294 when he became involved in a war with France, foreshadowing the 100 Years' War initiated under his grandson 40 years later. Edward's brief efforts in this regard proved enormously expensive and produced zero advantages for either him or the French. But it was in Scotland where things truly deteriorated. Edward must surely have felt he had achieved tremendous success in 1296 when he defeated the Scots and effectively incorporated Scotland into England, leaving the Northern Kingdom without its own king for the next decade. even ones selected by Edward to essentially act as a vassal, like John Balliol was in 1292. But success in the north consistently proved temporary. In 1297, under figures like Wallace and de Moray, the Scots rose successfully. Edward twice more seemed to have subdued them, in 1298 and 1305, but on both occasions, no sooner had he returned to England and the situation calmed than a fresh revolt emerged. The final one, led by Robert Bruce in early 1306, who declared himself King of Scotland after a 10-year interregnum, was never fully suppressed and ultimately led to Scottish independence being regained many years later.